Anytime I ask someone to help out, like teaching or doing something in the, some sort of ministry in the church, often it's like helping out with confirmation, or maybe it's, First Reconciliation, First Eucharist. Maybe it's some other sort of event, or maybe it's just when I ask someone, well, why don't you share talk about your faith with that person? Why don't you share what you have? Inevitably, one of several sort of rote answers come to mind. They say, I don't know enough. I don't know the faith enough. I just don't know enough. Or, they'll say, I'm just not a skilled enough person to do this. I just don't have the talent. I'm not good enough. Or perhaps the most silly, they'll say something to the effect that I'm not holy enough. And truth be told, if holiness were a prerequisite to be able to do ministry in the church, we would all be in big trouble, myself especially. Right? That holiness is in fact not a prerequisite. Neither is really having the strongest knowledge of faith. I mean, it's helpful, don't get me wrong, to understand our history, our tradition, and why some symbols mean one thing and not another, but it in itself isn't necessarily needed to share your faith, to talk about God, to enter into this amazing and wonderful process that we talk about every Sunday, that we participate in, sort of the ritual of the Mass, that we participate in when we talk about our sacraments and all of those meaningful moments in our lives. We hear that time and time again in today's readings. The first reading from Isaiah is this beautiful image of God coming and inviting Isaiah to ministry. And of course, the first thing he says is, Lord, I've got a sinful mouth among other sinful people, like I'm definitely not worthy. And in this metaphor, this beautiful image of God taking a charcoal, a lighted piece of fire, and putting that in his mouth and said, now you're ready. Now, I don't know if you've ever had coffee that was too hot, or maybe like apple pie that burned the roof of your mouth. I'm usually not in the best way of speaking immediately after putting something incredibly hot in my mouth, right? Like, it's a little counterintuitive. Yes, maybe his mouth was cleaner, but it definitely wasn't necessarily made ready to sort of proclaim the gospel. But that's just the point. The first act for Isaiah is actually to go in hearing and not necessarily speaking. And that's perhaps the most important prerequisite to enter into any ministry. It's not so much what we have to say, but that opportunity to listen to other people tell their story, to share where they're at, to meet them in that very place that they come, sometimes broken, sometimes joyful, depending on where they are in their faith journey. They come before the church, before God, and desire to share their story. Isaiah had to go mute. But we hear that time and time again. Jeremiah, I'm too young, and God says, no, you're not. I'm calling you now. Or we hear in today's gospel, Peter, who literally is going to become the head of the church, say, depart from me, I am a sinful man. And Jesus doesn't correct him by saying, no, you're not sinful. Oh, come on, get over it. Like, no, Peter's recognizing something authentic about himself. But Jesus says that's not the point. I need you. I need you to do this thing. I need you to enter into this ministry. I need you to be part of the team that is to sort of bring the good news. And in a lot of ways, whether it's, again, in that sacramental preparation, or maybe it's, bringing your faith out into the world to speak to justice. Maybe I don't know all the things that I'm supposed to talk about. Or maybe I haven't made it to being thoroughly anti-racist enough, or I haven't made it to being, thoroughly understanding of the problem or the situation, or, all of those things that hold us back. But notice, in all of our readings today, God says, not the point. I need you. And interestingly enough, God is still saying that to each and every one of us here today. That God needs us to enter into the world to act on God's behalf, to bring justice, to bring love, to bring that listening ear to the people of God so that they can encounter this mercy and this love that we preach, the mercy and love that we encounter in our sacraments, the greatest of which is Holy Eucharist, in which we receive the very body and blood of Christ. This great and wonderful mystery. We're still being invited to do that. And sometimes the very act of knowing that you're invited is itself intimidating. It's overwhelming. Well, what should I do? What can I do? And, if you think about it in a large institution, that can be a complex sort of moment. A moment that I think Jesuits are uniquely positioned to help walk with people, because we're really good at this thing called discernment. And over the next several weeks of my preaching, I'm going to talk about various different elements of discernment, because in some ways, as I prepare to take on the ministry of being pastor here at St. Thomas More, I think we are in a moment of discernment, a moment of examining sort of where we have been and looking at it with great joy, because I think there's a lot to celebrate. There's a moment of reflection of the here and now. Where is it that we are being called to minister into this place, this very physical, real place here in the Twin Cities that has a lot of things going on in it? And this great invitation then to react to that reality here and now, to imagine where we might be in the future. We will call this a parish examen, as it were. And so for the first step is just to sort of talk about what we mean by examen and how that really helps us in discernment. Because at the core of all of our readings today, each of the people being called, including Paul, who I love how he puts this, is someone abnormally born, right? He wasn't with the 12. He wasn't there when Jesus actually resurrected those 3 days after the crucifixion. He wasn't there. He talks about it wonderfully, but he admits, I wasn't actually part of that initial group. It's part of the thing that he's talking about in this letter to the Corinthians, right? That he's trying to mention, I get it. I'm not part of this group, but I'm still saying something important here, because what we believe is so powerful, so amazing, and so transformative. And think about it, it is sort of ridiculous. Like, if we don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, there's a lot of other questions that I have. And so Paul is putting it out on the line, but he acknowledges that he himself didn't come about this in the right way. And later on, and at different points in his letters in the New Testament, he speaks time and again about how he persecuted the church, how he objectively stood there. And the Acts of the Apostles, the book actually tells us, he watched Stephen be stoned and did nothing. He was complicit in the injustice of that moment. And yet he had another more powerful moment, that despite all of that, when he was knocked down on that road to Damascus, and he looked up and needed help, and he needed someone to explain to him what had just happened, God doesn't make it easy, right? He makes him blind. He gives him cataracts. He has to go in. He has to sort of face that fear and that moment of having to be transformed and dependent on other people. But in that process, we get the greatest evangelist to the Gentiles of all of history. That almost every church I can think of has both a statue of St. Peter and one of St. Paul. Our town is named for this great apostle. Abnormally born, he says. Out of place. He didn't know enough, he says. If he'd listened to those doubts, if he'd listened to those fears, we can only imagine where we'd be today. Or worse, we could imagine that our town might still be called Pig's Eye. True story. But in discernment, we do the first and most important thing. We recognize that God is a part of the journey. So I'm going to give you 5 P's. Now, I know that some other people have come up with ways of doing the examen, and if you Google the word Jesuit examen or the words Jesuit examen, you're going to hear a lot of different ways of doing this. But why this is so important is because how can we know what's going to happen in the world, what we should do corporately as a larger entity, if we're not interiorly aware of what's going on in our life? And we do that by this regular examination. And it's not just sort of an examination of conscience of where have I gone wrong, but really it is a noticing of God's action in our life. Like Isaiah, the first action isn't to speak, it is to listen, it is to notice, it is to pay attention, it is to be aware. And so these 5 P's in order of the examen, the first is presence. Focus on the presence of God here and now. We might not necessarily feel God's presence in the way that we feel somebody sitting right next to us, but to focus on God's presence, to recognize that all of creation is imbued with the glory of God, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says. This beautiful sense in which God is palatable in all things, and just simply to come to an awareness that God is present, whether it's here and now at church, or when you're in your van going home, or maybe as you wake up tomorrow morning, to any of those moments. As a side note, Jesuits are asked to do this twice a day for 15 minutes. But that's a good goal. I'm still working on it, and I've been doing this for 15 years. If it takes you, at first all you got is 5, good. If all you got is 1, good. But take that time to acknowledge and be present in that moment to recognize these steps, if only just for 1 minute. And it begins by acknowledging God's presence. And then Ignatius says that the greatest of all sins is the sin of ingratitude. And so the second step is to give praise to God, praise of thanksgiving. Let us be mindful of the gifts that God has given us. The gifts of family, the gifts of service through the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, the gifts of being able to participate in a world and in a place in this moment. Even if it's broken and shattered and has all of these other things, it is still kind of a gift to be able to be here and to be with all of you. And after you've paused for thanksgiving, this praise of thanksgiving, pay attention. That's the third P. Pay attention to what's moving in your heart and in your mind. I think too often people think that in order to pray, you have to be, laser focused. And a better example of prayer and paying attention is sort of like sitting on the edge of a river. That there are a lot of things that will be sort of floating by, right? If you've ever, gone to the Mississippi River and you kind of see, there's leaves and trees and, other things maybe floating in the river, some of it important and some of it just sort of drift as it goes along. And the focus isn't trying to figure out that one thing you're supposed to focus on, but just sort of to take it in gently, with praise, with love. Just pay attention to what's being moved in your heart. You might notice, that conversation I had yesterday, that's still in my mind. Good. Or you might notice, I'm really upset by the news lately, what happened in Minneapolis, that I feel like something needs to be done, the police and everything that's going on. Like, good. Notice that. But if other things come to mind, much as the river continues to flow, allow it to flow past you, because the things that will strike your imagination will stand forward. And then the one thing that sort of like really you hold on to, you keep going back to as you watch this river, present that for God, the fourth P. Present it to God. And because at the end of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, he kind of has all of the retreatants pray this beautiful prayer of surrender. That all that we've been given, all of the gifts and talents, they're not ours. We don't possess them. We surrender them. We give them back to God, that they can be transformed, that our hearts maybe be moved, that the action kind of stem from within and to see what is going on in our hearts and in our minds. And we propose to God what we want to do with that. What God might, hand back to us in those moments. So sit in the presence of God. Pause for thanksgiving. Pay attention, present, and propose. This examination process, I think, will be made more clear as we talk out through the rest of this month and how we use that into discernment. But I invite each of you to try the process. And, if my language was unhelpful, go online. Again, Jesuit Examen. Every university has a card that they can print out. I'm sure we have cards around here somewhere that we can, pass out and hand out for you too. But the reality is to take that moment and notice what is happening inside of you first. And then recognize, like Isaiah, like Paul, like Peter, like Anastasia, like Saint Scholastica, like Saint Teresa, you have been called. The work is plenty, but the laborers are few.